May 27, 1942. The basement of the old administration building, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Deere stared at the 5-digit number group sprawled across his desk, his eyes burning from yet another marathon shift in the windowless vault that housed Station Hypo. The Benzedrine tablets kept him alert, but they couldn't relieve the crushing weight of responsibility pressing down on every decision. The pencil in his hand trembled slightly as he made another entry on the worksheet before him. Beside him, towers of IBM punch cards rose like monuments to months of meticulous labor. Each card represented hours of analysis, countless cross-references, and the accumulated knowledge of a team pushed beyond ordinary human limits. Everything hinged on what these numbers revealed: everything: the war, the Pacific Fleet, thousands of American lives hanging in the balance. He reached for another punch card from the stack, comparing code groups against the patterns his team had painstakingly constructed over 6 months of grueling work. In a war room 3 floors above, Admiral Chester Nimitz waited for intelligence that would determine whether he risked his last 3 aircraft carriers against a Japanese armada that outnumbered him in every category of ship. The stakes could not have been higher. After Pearl Harbor, after months of defeats across the Pacific, this might be America's only opportunity to halt Japanese expansion. One error, one misread code group, one faulty assumption, and the war in the Pacific could be lost before summer ended. Deere's fingers moved over the IBM card sorter, searching for a pattern that might reveal the enemy's intentions. His colleague, Commander Joseph Rushford, stood nearby in his familiar bathrobe and slippers, having not left the underground bunker for days. The bathrobe was not eccentric, although many would later describe it that way. The basement was suffocating, poorly ventilated, and the heat from the IBM machines made proper uniforms unbearable. Rushford's approach was purely practical. Results mattered more than military protocol in this cramped, stifling workspace, where the fate of nations was decided by men hunched over code sheets and punch cards. Neither man knew that in the coming week, their efforts would change the course of World War II. The message intercepts were clear on one point: the Imperial Japanese Navy was planning its largest operation since Pearl Harbor. For fleet carriers, dozens of supporting warships, and hundreds of the world's most experienced naval aviators were converging on a target designated by 2 letters in the Japanese code AF. The question that haunted every man in that basement vault was simple but devastating: what was AF? Where would the Japanese strike next? Get it wrong, and America could lose the Pacific War before summer ended. The mathematics of potential disaster were brutally simple. Japan had 10 fleet carriers. America had 3 left in the Pacific, and one of those, Yorktown, was badly damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. If Nimitz positioned his carriers incorrectly, or if Station Hypo's analysis proved flawed, the Japanese could achieve what Pearl Harbor had failed to accomplish: the total destruction of American naval power in the Pacific. The transformation had begun 6 months earlier on a morning that would forever alter both nations. December 7, 1941, dawned bright and calm across the Hawaiian Islands. Families prepared for church. Sailors aboard the battleships moored at Pearl Harbor were eating breakfast or catching a few extra hours of sleep on what should have been a quiet Sunday morning. The Pacific Fleet lay at anchor, powerful but complacent, unaware that catastrophe was minutes away. At 7:55, peace ended. 353 Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor in 2 devastating waves. The attack had been planned with meticulous precision by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist who understood both Japan's temporary advantage and America's long-term industrial supremacy. His goal was straightforward: destroy the Pacific Fleet before America could fully mobilize its vast resources, giving Japan 6 months to a year to consolidate its conquests across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, then negotiate peace from a position of strength. Within 2 hours, the results were catastrophic. 8 battleships lay sunk or damaged. The USS Arizona exploded with such force that over 1,100 men perished instantly, entombed forever in their ship. A 1,800 pounds armor-piercing bomb penetrated the forward magazine, triggering a blast so massive it lifted the 30,000-ton warship from the water. Men who witnessed it from nearby ships would never forget the sight of Arizona rising, breaking apart, and settling to the harbor bottom in under 9 minutes. The USS Oklahoma capsized after torpedo hits opened massive holes in her port side, trapping 429 sailors and Marines inside. Some survived in air pockets for days, their desperate hammering audible to rescue teams who could not reach them in time. The USS West Virginia sank with 106 crew lost. Unlike Oklahoma and Arizona, West Virginia would eventually be raised, repaired, and returned to service, participating in major Pacific battles. But on December 7, she was another symbol of American vulnerability. Over 180 aircraft destroyed on the ground, hangars and maintenance facilities demolished, 2,403 Americans dead, Navy 2008, Marine Corps 109, Army 218, civilians 68, with another 1,000 wounded. The Pacific Fleet, America's shield against Japanese expansion, lay shattered. Admiral Husband Kimmel, Pacific Fleet commander, watched his command burn from the windows of his headquarters. As he stood there, still trying to comprehend the scale of the disaster, a spent bullet shattered glass beside him. He picked up the deformed projectile, examined it, then whispered to an aide that it would have been merciful had it killed him. Kimmel realized his career was over, he would bear responsibility for America's greatest military disaster. Within days, he would be relieved of command, replaced by Admiral Chester Nimitz. His request for a court-martial to clear his name was denied. The blame for Pearl Harbor would follow him to his grave, yet the attack, devastating as it was, had missed the most critical targets. All three Pacific Fleet carriers were absent that morning. The Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island, delayed by weather that proved providential. The Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway. The Saratoga sat in dry dock on the West Coast for maintenance. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, would win this war, though few yet understood that fundamental shift in naval power. The era of the battleship as the dominant naval weapon was ending. The era of carrier warfare was beginning, and America, through a combination of luck and Japanese miscalculation, still retained its carriers. The Japanese had also ignored Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, massive installations holding millions of gallons of oil that kept the fleet operational. They bypassed the repair yards, dry docks, submarine bases, and naval yard infrastructure, assuming these would be irrelevant after the fleet was destroyed. They were catastrophically wrong. These intact facilities would enable Pearl Harbor to serve as the staging point for America's Pacific counteroffensive. Submarines based there would devastate Japanese merchant shipping. The repair yards would resurrect damaged ships, including some the Japanese believed sunk. Within months, Pearl Harbor would transform from a symbol of defeat into a hub of activity supporting the war effort. In that basement vault at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rushford faced an impossible task. Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit in Hawaii, had been monitoring Japanese communications for years, but with limited success. Officially designated Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, everyone called it Station Hypo, using the phonetic code for H, standing for Hawaii, where one of the radio intercept towers was located. Before Pearl Harbor, they could read perhaps 10 to 15% of Japanese naval messages, and most of those only partially. It provided some intelligence value, but not enough to predict major operations like the Pearl Harbor attack. The main Japanese operational code, designated JN-25 by American cryptanalysts, consisted of roughly 30,000 to 33,000 five-digit number groups, each representing a word or phrase. The system was ingenious in its complexity. Each five-digit group in the code book corresponded to a specific word, phrase, or concept. To make decryption harder, the Japanese super-enciphered these code groups using additive tables, essentially encrypting messages twice. First, the message was encoded using the code book, then random five-digit numbers from separate additive books were added to each code group using non-carrying addition. The result was a message of random numbers resistant to frequency analysis and pattern recognition. Breaking this system required stripping away the additive layer mathematically, then determining the meaning of each five-digit code group through painstaking analysis of usage patterns across thousands of intercepted messages. Cryptanalysts had to identify which additive table had been used, subtract the additives to reveal the original code groups, then deduce each group's meaning. And the Japanese frequently changed both the code books and additive tables, forcing analysts to start over repeatedly. The additive books contain 300 pages, each listing 100 random five-digit numbers. To encrypt a message, the sender would start at a specified page and line, adding each successive additive to the corresponding code group. The receiver, knowing the starting point, could subtract the same additives to retrieve the original code groups. For American cryptanalysts, identifying which additive book and starting point had been used was the first challenge. Sometimes radio call signs or message indicators provided clues, other times, hundreds of possibilities had to be tested. On December 1, 1941, just 6 days before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese switched to a new version of JN-25, designated JN-25B by American analysts. The new version used a different code book and additive tables, forcing cryptanalysts to start over from scratch. Every code group painstakingly identified became useless overnight. Every additive recovery technique might no longer work. Analysts were back at the beginning, staring at streams of 5-digit numbers that might as well have been hieroglyphics. Rushford knew an attack was coming somewhere. Traffic analysis, the study of communication patterns without reading actual messages, showed increased Japanese naval activity. Radio call signs changed more frequently. Message volume spiked. Ships were moving. Something major was imminent. But the Japanese strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor had maintained perfect radio silence on their voyage from Japan. The 6 carriers and escorts transmitted nothing. Ships that emit no signals cannot be tracked. The Pearl Harbor Task Force had departed from Hitakapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, taking a northern Pacific route where merchant ships or patrol aircraft were unlikely. For 11 days, they maintained absolute communications discipline. Not a single radio transmission revealed their location or intentions. It was the most profound intelligence failure in American history. Cryptanalysts, traffic analysts, and intelligence officers had pieces of the puzzle, but not enough to see the complete picture. Some warnings reached Washington. Japanese diplomatic messages, encrypted in a different system called Purple, had been partially decoded and showed mounting tension. But these messages contained no operational details. The attack came as a complete and devastating surprise. Rushford understood that dwelling on failure would ensure more disasters. The only path forward was through enemy communications. If Station Hypo could break JN-25B and read enough Japanese messages, they could understand Japanese plans. Perhaps Pearl Harbor need not be repeated. Perhaps intelligence could give Admiral Nimitz the one weapon to offset Japan's current advantage, knowledge of enemy intentions. Joseph John Rushford had been an unlikely candidate for such critical work. Born in Dayton, Ohio, on May 12, 1900, he enlisted in the Navy in 1918 at age 17. When joining, he claimed his birth year as 1898 to appear older and more eligible for advancement, a falsification that would persist in his service records throughout his career. He was commissioned as an ensign after graduating from the Navy's Steam Engineering School at Stevens Institute of Technology on June 14, 1919. His early career suggested nothing special, just another young officer working his way through the ranks. But a fellow officer noticed something others had missed. Rushford had a talent for solving crossword puzzles. He was excellent at auction bridge, an advanced card game requiring pattern recognition, memory, and logical deduction. These weren't trivial skills. They indicated a mind that could find patterns in complexity, that could make logical inferences from incomplete information. The officer recommended Rushford Navy's cryptanalysis program, a small specialized field that desperately needed talented recruits. In the early 1920s, naval cryptanalysis consisted of perhaps a dozen people. Working in cramped offices, barely funded, barely understood, trying to read the communications of potential adversaries. Rushford proved to be a natural, but he possessed something beyond mathematical ability. In the mid-1920s, the Navy sent him to Japan for 3 years of language and cultural study from 1929 to 1932. During those years, Rushford lived in Tokyo, studied Japanese at the Navy's language school, and immersed himself in Japanese culture. He didn't just learn the language. He learned how Japanese people thought, how they communicated, how their military culture shaped their decision-making. He understood Japanese concepts of honor, duty, and hierarchical communication. This cultural knowledge combined with his cryptoanalytic training made him uniquely qualified to lead Station Hypo. When war came, his deputy-in-chief Kripolisti was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Deere, a Naval Academy graduate, who had trained under Agnes Driscoll, the legendary Kripolisti who had pioneered the use of IBM punch card machines for codering. Driscoll, known throughout the cryptolytic community as Miss Aggie, had been breaking codes since World War I. She had trained many of the Navy's best CRYP analysts and had made crucial breakthroughs against Japanese naval codes in the 1920s and 1930s. Her insight that IBM tabulating machines could be adapted for cryptalysis had revolutionized the field. Deere had been stationed at Pearl Harbor since 1936, longer than anyone else in the unit. He possessed an encyclopedic memory for code groups and an almost supernatural ability to recognize patterns in seemingly random numbers. He could look at a partially decoded message and intuited what the missing code groups might represent based on context and usage patterns from other messages. During the intense period leading up to Midway, Deere often worked extended shifts with the help of benzodrine tablets to maintain alertness. The amphetamines were standard issue for personnel working critical assignments that required staying awake for extended periods. I figured there were people out there getting shot at, Deere later explained in oral history interviews. If it should happen that it turned out to inflict some injury on my health in the long run, so what? His colleagues joked that his desk sign was accurate when it read, "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." The sign, visible to anyone entering the crypt analysis section, captured the reality of the work. The CRYP analysis section was indeed a strange place by military standards. Officers worked in bathrobes and slippers when the heat became unbearable in the basement facility. The IBM machines generated tremendous heat, and the basement's inadequate ventilation made proper uniforms impractical during marathon work sessions. Formal military discipline evaporated in favor of results. Rank mattered less than analytical skill. Rashford fostered an environment where junior officers could question senior officers if the analysis demanded it, where credit for breakthroughs went to the team rather than individuals. As Rashford often said, "We can accomplish anything provided no one cares who gets the credit." This philosophy was revolutionary in a military context where hierarchy and credit for success were usually paramount. But Rashford understood that breaking JN25 required collaboration, cross-pollination of ideas, and the willingness to challenge assumptions regardless of who had made them. A junior enlisted radioman might notice a pattern that a senior officer had missed. A linguist might provide context that helped CRYP analysts understand the meaning of a partially decoded message. Everyone's insights mattered. This collaborative culture would prove essential when the pressure reached its peak in the spring of 1942. The linguistics section was led by Marine Captain Alva Laswell, who had studied Japanese for 3 years in Tokyo as part of the same exchange program that had trained Rashford. During the Midway period, Well was actually promoted to Major on April 29, 1942. Though he continued to be referred to by his previous rank in many accounts, he worked with 5 other linguists who represented the Navy's best Japanese language specialists. Their job was to translate the portions of messages that the crypt analysts could decrypt, then work with intelligence analysts to determine what the messages meant in the larger context of Japanese naval operations. A partially decoded message mentioning carriers, aircraft, and fuel might mean a training exercise or might mean an impending major operation. The linguists provided the cultural and linguistic context that helped distinguish between routine communications and critical intelligence. The traffic analysis section led by Lieutenant Commanders Thomas Huckins and John Williams focused on message externals rather than content. They tracked which stations were communicating with each other, monitored the volume of traffic between units, analyzed priority designations, and mapped the patterns of communication that might reveal operational plans, even when the messages themselves remained encrypted. Traffic analysis could provide warning of major operations days or weeks before crypt analysts could read enough messages to understand the details. Increase in message traffic between carrier divisions and supply units might indicate an impending sortie. Changes in radio call signs often preceded major operations. The sudden radio silence of a carrier division could mean they were underway for combat operations. This small team working in a windowless basement with inadequate equipment and overwhelming workload would soon face the most important intelligence challenge in American history. The work was painfully slow and frustrating. Each intercepted message arrived as a string of 5-digit number groups captured by radio intercept stations scattered across the Pacific. Radio men at stations in Hawaii, Australia, and other locations listened to Japanese naval frequencies 24 hours a day, transcribing every message they heard. These messages were forwarded to Station Hypo for analysis. First, the CRYP analysts had to strip off the additive encryption using mathematical analysis. The Japanese used additive tables where they added another 5-digit number to each code group, using non-carrying addition. This meant that if a code group was 12345 and the additive was 67,890, the encrypted result was 79,135. Adding each digit separately without carrying to the next position. Decryption required identifying which additive table had been used for each message, then subtracting the additive to reveal the original code group. This process alone could take hours for a single message. The crypt analysts maintained massive files of recovered additives organized by date and radio circuit, trying to identify patterns in how the Japanese used their additive tables. Once they had the original code groups, the real work began. The CRYP analysts maintained massive card catalogs representing years of accumulated knowledge about what each 5-digit number might mean. They made educated guesses based on context, comparing how specific code groups appeared in different messages, building slowly toward certainty. A code group that appeared frequently in messages between carriers might mean aircraft or aviation gasoline or flight operations. One that appeared in logistics messages might mean fuel or supplies or ammunition. The IBM punch card machines helped them search through thousands of messages to find patterns, comparing usage contexts, identifying code groups that appeared together frequently, building networks of meaning. But the actual analysis required human intelligence, intuition, and often brilliant guesses. The machines could sort and search, but only human analysts could interpret the results, make intuitive leaps, and recognize meaningful patterns in the chaos of partially decoded messages. It was detective work of the highest order, requiring mathematical precision, linguistic knowledge, cultural understanding, and creative thinking. By March 1942, Station Hypo had made sufficient progress against JN-25 that they could provide useful intelligence about Japanese operations. The breakthrough hadn't come from a single dramatic moment, but from months of grinding work. Each recovered code group made subsequent messages slightly more readable. Each identified additive pattern made stripping the encryption slightly faster. Gradually, painfully, the opacity of Japanese communications began to yield. They had contributed intelligence to the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, helping the U.S. Navy locate Japanese carriers and achieve a tactical draw that halted Japan's advance toward Australia. Coral Sea was significant for multiple reasons. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never came within sight of each other. All combat conducted by aircraft. It demonstrated that American carriers and pilots could fight effectively against the experienced Japanese carrier forces, and it damaged 2 Japanese carriers. Shokaku and Zuiako, keeping them out of action for the next major operation. But the work remained frustratingly incomplete. Even at their best, they could read perhaps 30 to 40% of any given message. Many messages remained completely opaque. The Japanese continued to change code books and additives, requiring constant adaptation, and the pressure was relentless. Every message might contain intelligence that could save American lives or prevent another disaster. Every hour spent on a message that yielded nothing was an hour that could have been spent on something more productive. The CRYP analysts worked with the knowledge that their success or failure would be measured in American casualties. Then in mid-May they began intercepting messages about a massive operation. The traffic volume increased dramatically. Messages flew between the combined fleet headquarters, carrier divisions, submarine squadrons, battleship divisions, and invasion forces. All pointed to a major offensive scheduled for early June. Japanese operational security was good, but they had to communicate to coordinate a complex operation involving dozens of ships operating across thousands of miles of ocean. Each message, even if only partially readable, provided another piece of the puzzle. The target was designated AF and the Japanese location. Code system. Station Hypo believed AF meant Midway Island, a tiny atoll 1,300 mi northwest of Hawaii that housed a small but strategically important American airbase. Midway consisted of two small islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, surrounded by a coral reef. The atoll measured just over 2 miles across, but its location made it crucial. If Japan captured Midway, they would threaten Hawaii itself and possess a base from which to interdict American communications across the Central Pacific. More importantly, a Japanese operation against Midway would force the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle. Admiral Yamamoto desperately wanted to destroy those carriers. He knew that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's once American shipyards began producing carriers in quantity. Japan needed to win the war in 1942. While they still held numerical and operational superiority. But in Washington, the Navy's main Krypton Analysis Center designated OP-20G disagreed with Station HYPO's assessment. OP-20G, located in the Navy Department Building in Washington, was ostensibly the superior organization. They had more personnel, better equipment, and the advantage of being located at the seat of naval power, but they lacked Station Hypo's specialized focus on the Pacific Theater and Rashford's team's cumulative experience with Japanese naval communications. The Washington analysts believed AF might be the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Some thought it could be a renewed offensive in the South Pacific toward Port Moresby, Fiji, or Samoa. Others feared an attack on Hawaii itself or even the American West Coast. Without certainty about the target, Admiral Nimitz couldn't position his forces effectively. If he concentrated his carriers near Midway and the Japanese attacked somewhere else, he would lose both his ships and the actual target of the Japanese offensive. The disagreement intensified through late May. OP-20G had been recently reorganized. Lawrence Safford, a brilliant CRYP analyst known as the father of Navy cryptology, had been replaced by Commander John Redmond, a communications officer with little cryptolytic experience. Redmond was competent in his previous field, but was, as one assessment noted, untrained in CRYP analysis. He brought a communications officer's perspective to an analytical organization, emphasizing proper procedures and chain of command over analytical insights. The bureaucratic battle between Station Hypo and OP-20G was about more than the location of the Japanese attack. It was about control of naval intelligence. Rashford reported directly to Nimitz's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Leighton, his friend from their years together studying Japanese in Tokyo from 1929 to 1932. This direct communication worked brilliantly within the Pacific Theater. Intelligence reached the commander who needed it without bureaucratic delays, but it infuriated the Washington command structure. Rashford was bypassing the established chain of command, providing intelligence directly to the fleet commander instead of routing it through official channels and OP-20G for validation. From Washington's perspective, this violated proper procedure and undermined central control of intelligence analysis. From Rashford's perspective, war didn't wait for bureaucracy, and Admiral Nimitz needed intelligence immediately, not after it had been reviewed, second-guessed, and delayed by multiple levels of command in Washington. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations who commanded the entire U.S. Navy, trusted his staff in Washington more than this informal arrangement in Hawaii. King was a brilliant but difficult man known for his abrasive personality and his insistence on proper procedure. He disliked Rashford intensely, viewing him as insubordinate and overly confident. Commander John Redmond, who led OP-20G, resented Rashford's independence and insisted that all intelligence analysis should be centralized in Washington, where it could be properly controlled and coordinated. The disagreement wasn't just about bureaucratic territory. Lives hung in the balance. If Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers near Midway and the Japanese attacked somewhere else, he would lose both his ships and the actual target of the Japanese offensive. With only 3 carriers against Japan's carrier fleet, America couldn't afford to be wrong even once. The Pacific Fleet couldn't sustain another Pearl Harbor-level disaster. If those 3 carriers were sunk, nothing would stand between Japan and Hawaii except a few submarines and some land-based aircraft. The West Coast would be vulnerable. The entire American position in the Pacific would collapse. Everything depended on determining what AF meant. Actually, it was Captain Wilfred J. Jasper Holmes, one of Station Hypo staff members, who conceived the brilliant idea that would settle the question. Holmes was a submariner by training who had been assigned to intelligence work. He had the practical mindset of an operational officer combined with an analytical mind. He suggested that Midway send an uncoded message reporting that their water desalination plant had broken down and the base was running short of fresh water. If the Japanese intercepted this message and then reported that AF was short of water, Station HYPO would have definitive proof that AF meant Midway. It was a simple ruse, almost too simple to work. But simplicity was its strength. The Japanese were intercepting American communications just as the Americans were reading Japanese messages. If they overheard an unencrypted emergency message about water shortages at Midway, they would have no reason to suspect it was false. Water desalination equipment broke down regularly in tropical climates. A shortage would be a natural result of equipment failure. The Japanese intelligence services would report this useful tactical information about a potential target. Rashford immediately recognized the brilliance of Holmes's idea and brought it to Edwin Leighton, who presented it to Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz was the kind of commander willing to trust his intelligence officers and take calculated risks. He approved the plan immediately. The garrison commander at Midway received instructions via secure submarine cable, a communications method the Japanese couldn't intercept, to transmit an emergency request for water supplies in plain language that anyone monitoring radio frequencies could intercept. Around May 19 to 21, 1942, Midway sent the message. The transmission went out in clear, unencrypted language, reporting equipment problems and requesting emergency water supplies from Pearl Harbor. Within 2 days, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese intelligence report. The message sent in JN25 and partially decrypted by Rashford's team stated that AF was experiencing water shortages. The proof was irrefutable. AF meant Midway. The Japanese were coming. But Washington remained skeptical. OP-20G insisted the attack would come in mid-June, while Station Hypo predicted late May or early June based on date indicators in the messages. The date time groups in Japanese messages were super-enciphered beyond the standard JN25 encryption, making them particularly difficult to decrypt. OP-20G hadn't broken the date-time encryption. Station Hypo had, thanks to a breakthrough by Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan. Finnegan, working under Deer's supervision, discovered the method the Japanese used to encrypt their daytime groups. It was a separate system layered on top of JN25, requiring additional mathematical analysis. Edwin Layton in his memoir, and I was there specifically credited Finnegan with discovering the method that the Japanese had used to lock up their daytime groups. This breakthrough allowed Station Hypo to determine not just where the Japanese would strike, but when. On May 26, they intercepted orders for 2 destroyer groups escorting invasion transports and successfully decrypted the daytime data using Finnegan's methods. The orders specified that the attack would occur on either June 4 or 5, 1942. This level of precision was unprecedented. Admiral Nimitz would know not just where to position his forces, but when the enemy would arrive. The Washington analysts questioned whether Rashford was being too aggressive in his interpretations, reading certainty into partial messages, letting his confidence overcome analytical caution. Admiral King remained unconvinced. The career consequences for Rashford, if he was wrong, would be catastrophic. He would be blamed for misleading the Pacific Fleet commander for risking America's last carriers on a faulty analysis. His career would be over, and worse, American sailors would die because of his mistake. But Rashford stood by his analysis. His team had been working 18 to 24-hour shifts for weeks, surviving on coffee, cigarettes, and occasional sandwiches brought to the basement. The evidence was overwhelming. The volume of message traffic, the units involved, the logistical preparations, the date indicators, and the Wateroo's confirmation all pointed to the same conclusion. Midway, early June, for carriers. This was Japan's next major operation. By May 27, Rashford's team had decrypted enough messages to provide Nimitz with almost the entire Japanese order of battle. They knew the Japanese force would include 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the most experienced carrier division in the world. They knew the force would include 2 battleships, among them Yamamoto's flagship Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built. They knew about the 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers providing escort. They knew about approximately 250 carrier aircraft flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience. They knew about the invasion force carrying 5,000 troops scheduled to land on Midway on June 7. The intelligence was so detailed that Nimitz's staff could predict the Japanese approach route, the timing of the first air strikes, and even the composition of the attack formations. On May 27, 1942, at the Pacific Fleet Staff Conference, Rashford and Layton presented this intelligence to Admiral Nimitz. The room was crowded with staff officers, many skeptical that such detailed intelligence could be accurate. Rashford, still in his bathrobe, walked them through the analysis, explaining how each conclusion had been reached, showing them the partially decrypted messages, demonstrating the analytical process that had yielded such specific information. No navy in history had ever possessed such complete intelligence about an enemy's operational plans before the battle began. It was a Cryptoanalytic achievement that would never be repeated at this scale. The combination of station hypos. Breakthrough against JN-25, the volume of Japanese communications. And the Japanese assumption that their codes were secure had created a perfect intelligence window. Nimitz now knew things that many Japanese officers didn't know. He understood Yamamoto's strategy better than some of Yamamoto's subordinates. But intelligence alone doesn't win battles. Nimitz faced a terrible calculus. He had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Enterprise and Hornet were in good condition, but Yorktown was badly damaged. The carrier had been so severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea that initial assessments estimated 3 months of repairs at Puget Sound Navy Yard on the West Coast. Structural damage to the flight deck. Damage to the fuel system, fires that had killed dozens of crew members. Yorktown should have been out of action until late summer. Nimitz made one of the most consequential decisions of the war. He told the repair crews at Pearl Harbor they had 3 days to make Yorktown battle-worthy. Not fully repaired, not restored to perfect condition, but functional enough to launch and recover aircraft to fight one more battle. The repair crews thought it was impossible. They were being asked to accomplish in 72 hours what would normally take 90 days. What followed was a near miracle of industrial effort. Yorktown entered Dry Dock No. 1 at 11 a.m. on May 28. Over 1,400 workers swarmed the ship, working around the clock. Welders repaired structural damage to the flight deck. Electricians restored damaged systems. Damage control teams patched holes. Some repairs were temporary expedients that would require proper fixing later, but they would hold for one more battle. The ship was still carrying some repair crew when she steamed out the morning of May 30th, heading to join Enterprise and Hornet. Approximately 48 to 72 hours of actual repair work, compressed into 3 calendar days. A remarkable achievement that enabled Yorktown's crucial participation in the battle against Japan's 4 fleet carriers and experienced aviators. Nimitz could field 3 carriers with less experienced pilots. The Japanese had been at war since 1937. Their naval aviators had hundreds of hours of combat experience in China and across the Pacific. They had trained together for years developing sophisticated tactics. Their aircraft carriers had operated together as a strike force since the beginning of the war, achieving perfect coordination. American carrier doctrine was still evolving. Many American pilots had never seen combat. Some had only basic training in carrier operations. The disparity in experience was enormous. The numbers were daunting in every category. But Nimitz had the ultimate advantage that Rashford had given him: perfect intelligence. He positioned his carriers at a location they named Point Luck, 350 miles northeast of Midway, where they could ambush the Japanese carriers after the first strike on Midway's airfields. The Japanese, confident that they had achieved surprise, expected to attack the undefended island, recover their aircraft, rearm them with different weapons, and then hunt for American carriers they assumed were still at Pearl Harbor, or at least several days away from the battle area. Admiral Chuchi Nagamo, commanding the Japanese carrier strike force, believed he would have hours to conduct operations before encountering any American opposition. He expected to bomb Midway into submission, then spend the afternoon searching for American ships, if any were nearby. The possibility that 3 American carriers were already positioned northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush, never occurred to him. Japanese naval intelligence had assured him that Yorktown was sunk at Coral Sea, that Enterprise and Hornet were thousands of miles away, and that no American carriers could possibly be near Midway when his forces arrived. Nimitz's gamble was almost incomprehensible in its boldness. If Rashford was wrong about the location, timing, or Japanese force composition, the Pacific Fleet would be destroyed, and Hawaii would be defenseless. If Washington's analysis was correct and the attack came elsewhere, Nimitz would lose both his carriers and the actual Japanese target. If the intelligence was right, but the battle went badly, America would lose its last 3 carriers, and the war in the Pacific would be lost. Nimitz was staking everything on the analysis of intercepted messages performed by a small group of exhausted men working in a basement with primitive equipment. Everything depended on the analysis of intercepted messages, on the accuracy of code group identifications, on the correct interpretation of partially decoded messages, on the synthesis of fragments into a coherent picture. Roscher and his team had provided Nimitz with intelligence of unprecedented quality. Now American sailors and aviators would have to execute the battle that intelligence had made possible. On June 3, 1942, Navy patrol planes spotted the Japanese fleet approaching Midway from the northwest, exactly where Rashford had predicted. The PBY Catalina flying boats operating at the extreme limit of their range found the invasion transport group first, then the carriers. Each sighting report confirmed Station HYPO's analysis, location, timing, force composition, all matching the intelligence. Nimitz's gamble was validated. The trap was set. At dawn on June 4, 108 Japanese aircraft launched from the 4 carriers and headed for Midway. 36 ID-3A dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers armed with high-explosive bombs for land targets, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. American radar on Midway detected them 93 miles out at 0545 hours. The defenders scrambled every available aircraft to intercept. The Japanese strike devastated Midway's facilities, destroying fuel tanks, hangars, and the command post. American fighters tried to intercept, but were overwhelmed by the Zeros. Marine Corps pilots in obsolete F-2A Buffalo fighters suffered terrible casualties. Ground fire damaged some Japanese aircraft, but the attack achieved most of its objectives. The Japanese formation commander, examining the results, radioed back that a second strike would be necessary. Midway's runways were damaged but still operational. Defending aircraft had survived. The base wasn't completely suppressed. But the first real shock came with American aircraft from Midway attacking the Japanese carriers. Marine Corps dive bombers, Army Air Force B-7 bombers, and Navy torpedo bombers struck at the Japanese fleet without success, suffering heavy casualties. But they forced the Japanese to keep their combat air patrol engaged. They disrupted Japanese operations. They demonstrated that American forces were more capable and determined than Japanese intelligence had suggested. Admiral Chichi Nagumo faced a critical decision. His aircraft were returning from Midway, low on fuel and needing to land. The after-action assessment suggested a second strike on Midway would be necessary to completely suppress the base. Following doctrine, he ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed with land attack bombs for a second strike. Ordnance crews began removing the armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes from the aircraft spotted on the hangar decks, replacing them with high explosive bombs designed for land targets. Then at 7:28 a.m. everything changed. A Japanese scout plane launched late due to a catapult problem reported sighting 10 American surface ships to the northeast. The scout's initial report didn't specify ship types, but the presence of any American ships in the area was unexpected. Nagumo suddenly faced the possibility of American carriers in the area, something he had been assured was impossible. Yorktown was supposedly sunk. Enterprise and Hornet were supposedly nowhere near Midway. Nagumo immediately halted the rearming process and ordered his aircraft switched back to anti-ship weapons, torpedoes, and armor-piercing bombs. The ordnance crews reversed course, removing the land attack bombs they had just loaded, bringing up anti-ship weapons from the magazines. The flight decks and hangars of all 4 Japanese carriers became scenes of controlled chaos. Bombs that had just been mounted on aircraft were removed and sent below. Torpedoes were brought up from magazines and attached to aircraft. Fuel lines remained connected to planes as they were being rearmed. Loose ordnance, both bombs and torpedoes, piled up on deck because there wasn't time to properly store everything below while simultaneously preparing for launch. It was the most dangerous situation possible on an aircraft carrier. Fully fueled planes surrounded by loose bombs and torpedoes with aviation gas fumes thick in the air. At 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers arrived overhead. 3 squadrons of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had become separated from their fighters and torpedo bombers during the flight to the target, but they had found the Japanese carriers at the perfect moment. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had extended his search beyond the expected intercept point, gambling his fuel reserves on finding the Japanese. His decision paid off when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the carrier force. The Japanese carriers were attempting to launch their strike against the American fleet. Their decks were crowded with fully armed and fueled aircraft. Their combat air patrol fighters were at sea level, having just finished destroying the last of the American torpedo bomber attacks. The Devastator torpedo bombers from all 3 American carriers had attacked with suicidal courage, knowing their slow aircraft stood little chance against Zero's 41 torpedo bombers. Attacked, 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. But their sacrifice drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level and disrupted Japanese defensive coordination. The dauntless pilots pushed over into their dives from 14,000 feet, screaming down at speeds approaching 250 knots. In approximately 6 minutes of perfectly coordinated attacks, they destroyed 3 Japanese carriers. The timing was so precise, the attack so well executed that to Japanese observers it seemed like a single overwhelming assault. The Akagi took a bomb through the flight deck that detonated in the hangar bay among armed and fueled aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Fires spread instantly through aviation fuel spilled on the hangar deck. Within minutes, Akagi was burning out of control. Admiral Nagumo and his staff had to abandon the flagship. The car suffered 4 bomb hits in rapid succession. The forward elevator was blown out of its shaft. The bridge structure was wrecked. Fires engulfed the ship from bow to stern. Ammunition and fuel explosions continued for hours. Kaga's captain ordered abandon ship, but stayed aboard himself, going down with his command. The Soria took 3 direct hits. All 3 struck within seconds of each other, devastating the ship. The flight deck ruptured. The hangar became an inferno. Soria's crew fought to save their ship, but the damage was catastrophic. After 20 minutes of firefighting, the captain ordered the crew to abandon ship. He remained aboard. Soria sank 7 hours later, taking 711 men with her. All 3 carriers were doomed. Within minutes, their crews abandoning ship as uncontrollable fires consumed the vessels. Japanese damage control procedures, which emphasized firefighting over flooding control, couldn't cope with the scale of the damage and the fuel fires. The 4th carrier, Hiru, had become separated from the others earlier in the day and escaped the initial attack. She launched strikes that badly damaged the Yorktown, hitting the American carrier with bombs and torpedoes that brought her to a halt. But American dive bombers found the Hiru later that afternoon and left her burning like her sister ships. By evening on June 4, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sinking or abandoned. Japan lost 57 men, including many of her most experienced pilots and maintenance crews. Among the dead were some of the most skilled aviators in the world. Men who had bombed Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, destroyed the Prince of Wales and Repulse, and dominated the Pacific for 6 months. Their loss would prove impossible to replace. The United States lost the Yorktown, which succumbed to submarine torpedoes 2 days later while under tow. The Japanese submarine the 168 found the carrier on June 6 and put 2 torpedoes into her hull. A third torpedo sank the destroyer Hammond alongside Yorktown. The carrier rolled over and sank on June 7. American casualties totaled 362 men. In approximately 6 minutes of perfectly executed dive bombing, the war in the Pacific had changed. The transformation was total and irreversible. Japan had begun the war with overwhelming carrier strength. After Midway, she had lost 4 of her 6 fleet carriers and could not replace them. Japanese shipyards could not match American production capacity. The United States was about to commission dozens of new carriers from its enormous industrial base. The Essex-class carriers were already under construction, each one larger and more capable than the carriers lost at Midway. Japan would never again conduct offensive operations. Every subsequent battle would be defensive, attempting to hold what she had already captured. The mathematics of American industrial power would grind Japan down slowly but inevitably. The transformation that Rochefort's intelligence had made possible would shape the entire Pacific War. And it had all begun with 5-digit number groups on punch cards in a basement in Hawaii. The timing of the dive bomber attack, arriving just as the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, was partly luck, but also partly the result of understanding the enemy's operational procedures well enough to predict when they would be rearming aircraft. None of that would have been possible without the breakthrough against JN-25 and the brutal analytical work that allowed Rochefort's team to read Japanese intentions. But recognition for this achievement would prove elusive and politically fraught. The bureaucratic warfare between Station Hypo and OP-20G in Washington intensified after Midway. Rather than resolving, both organizations claimed credit for the victory. Washington argued that their analysis had contributed to the success. Station Hypo insisted their work had been decisive. The dispute became personal and bitter. Commander John Redman, who led OP-20G, resented Rochefort's independence and his direct relationship with Nimitz. Redman's brother, Rear Admiral Joseph Redmond, held a senior position in naval communications and supported his brother's efforts to centralize control of cryptanalysis in Washington. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, supported the Redmond brothers. King believed in centralized command and distrusted Rochefort's informal methods. In October 1942, just 4 months after Midway, Rochefort was relieved of command at Station Hypo and reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. The official reason was that he needed sea duty for career advancement. Everyone understood it as punishment for insubordination. Rochefort had been right about Midway. His analysis had enabled the greatest American naval victory of the war. But he had bypassed the chain of command, antagonized powerful officers in Washington, and made enemies of the Redmond brothers. Admiral Nimitz was reportedly enraged, but couldn't prevent the removal. King commanded the entire Navy. Nimitz commanded the Pacific Fleet. In a dispute between fleet commanders and the Chief of Naval Operations CO-1, Nimitz recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal immediately after Midway, citing his sustained superior performance and noting that his work contributed in large measure to the victory. King's office denied the award. Rashford would never return to cryptanalysis. He commanded the floating dry dock, a backwater assignment for an officer of his capabilities. Later, he was assigned to administrative duties at Pacific Fleet headquarters. He never received the sea command he wanted. He never advanced beyond the rank of captain. When he retired in 1953, it was without the recognition his Midway achievement deserved. The denial of recognition was a grave injustice that would take decades to correct. But the work continued throughout the rest of 1942 and into 1943. Station Hypo continued reading Japanese naval communications. Though under new leadership, the intelligence supported the Guadalcanal campaign where American and Japanese forces fought a brutal 6-month battle for control of a strategic island. Intelligence from decrypted messages helped position American ships for naval engagements, warned of Japanese reinforcement convoys, and provided strategic warning of Japanese intentions. The intelligence supported the island-hopping strategy across the Central Pacific as American forces bypassed strong Japanese garrisons and seized less defended islands, cutting Japanese supply lines and moving ever closer to Japan. Each operation benefited from signals intelligence that revealed Japanese dispositions, identified weak points, and warned of counterattacks. Station Hypo's work eventually contributed to Operation Vengeance in April 1943 when American fighters intercepted and shot down Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft based on decrypted flight plans. Yamamoto was flying from Rabaul to Bougainville to inspect frontline units. Station Hypo intercepted and decrypted messages containing his complete itinerary, including departure time, route, and arrival time. The intelligence went up the chain to President Roosevelt, who authorized the mission. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters flew from Guadalcanal, intercepted Yamamoto's transport exactly on schedule, and shot it down. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's greatest naval strategist, died in the jungle of Bougainville. His loss was a devastating blow to Japanese morale. Thomas Deere remained at Station Hypo throughout the war, rising to captain. His work on JN-25 and his supervision of the critical breakthroughs that enabled Midway would make him known within cryptologic circles as the father of machine cryptanalysis. After the war, he became one of the 3 primary cryptanalytic trainers for both the Armed Forces Security Agency and later the National Security Agency, along with William Friedman and Lamrose Kalimahos. His techniques for using IBM machines in CRYP analysis influenced a generation of signals intelligence professionals. Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer, who had championed Rashford's analysis and presented it to Nimitz, served throughout the Pacific War and retired as a rear admiral. He spent decades after the war working to get recognition for Rashford's contributions. His memoir, And I Was There, published in 1985, provided detailed documentation of Rashford's achievements and the injustice of his treatment. Layton never stopped advocating for his friend Joseph Finnegan, who discovered how to decrypt the Japanese daytime groups, continued his cryptanalytic career and became a leading figure in post-war signals intelligence. His breakthrough had been crucial to determining the attack date, allowing NIMS to position forces with perfect timing. Without knowing the date, American carriers might have arrived too early and exhausted their fuel, or too late and missed the battle entirely. The linguists, traffic analysts, and crypt analysts who had worked those impossible hours in the dungeon at Pearl Harbor went on to various careers. Most never spoke publicly about their wartime work due to classification restrictions that lasted for decades. The institutional memory of their achievement remained classified until the 1970s, more than 30 years after the war ended. Families didn't know what their fathers and husbands had done. Neighbors didn't understand why certain men had spent the war in Hawaii rather than fighting. The cryptanalysts carried their secrets in silence, unable to claim credit for achievements that had changed history. The true scope of American success against Japanese codes wasn't declassified until the mid-1970s when the National Security Agency began releasing historical documents about World War II CRYP analysis. Only then could historians and the public understand how thoroughly American CRYP analysts had penetrated Japanese communications, how much intelligence had shaped major battles, and how critical the work of men like Rashford and Deer had been to Allied victory. In 1980, a campaign began to secure proper recognition for Rashford's contributions. Admiral Donald Max Showers, who had worked in naval intelligence during the war and later served at the CIA, led the effort. He was joined by Navy Secretary John Lehman, who understood both the historical importance and the injustice of Rashford's treatment. The campaign gained momentum as classified documents became available to historians and the full story of Station Hypo's achievements could finally be told. On May 30, 1986, almost exactly 44 years after the Battle of Midway, President Ronald Reagan awarded the Distinguished Service Medal to Joseph Rashford posthumously. Rashford had died on July 20, 1976. Never knowing he would finally receive the recognition he had earned, but been denied. His children accepted the medal on his behalf at a White House ceremony. The citation praised his sustained superior performance and noted that his intelligence work contributed in large measure to the victory of the United States forces at Midway. It was an understated description of the most important intelligence achievement in American military history. The story of how one man's coder-breaking expertise changed the course of World War II reveals profound truths about intelligence, leadership, and innovation. Rashford succeeded because he blended multiple rare talents: mathematical aptitude for code analysis, linguistic and cultural familiarity with Japan gained during 3 years of study in Tokyo from 1929 to 1932, intelligence evaluation expertise, and leadership abilities that encouraged collaborative innovation. His readiness to bypass bureaucratic channels to deliver intelligence to the commander who required it demonstrated moral bravery. His insistence on precision despite pressure from Washington revealed intellectual honesty. His establishment of an environment where junior officers could contribute fully regardless of rank exhibited enlightened leadership. He recognized that breaking JN-25 demanded every team member operating at peak efficiency, exchanging insights, questioning assumptions, and synthesizing fragments into coherent intelligence. Thomas Dear's willingness to endure extended shifts aided by stimulants displayed commitment that exceeded normal expectations. The entire Station Hypo team proved that seemingly impossible challenges could be overcome through collaboration, ingenuity, and relentless effort. They understood that their work mattered more than personal comfort, rest, or health. The men defending Midway, the pilots flying into combat, and the sailors manning battle stations relied on the accuracy of Station Hypo intelligence. The technical accomplishment was extraordinary. Cracking JN-25 required not only mathematical skill but also intuition, pattern recognition, and the ability to think like the enemy. The IBM punch card machines assisted with sorting and searching, but the actual breakthroughs stemmed from human intelligence applying creativity to seemingly insurmountable problems. The scope of the task was staggering. With roughly 30,000 to 33,000 code groups in circulation, each message presented countless potential interpretations. Arriving at the correct meaning required years of accumulated experience, educated guesses confirmed through comparison with other messages, and the integration of partial information into actionable intelligence. There were no modern computers, no automated analysis systems, no machine learning algorithms, only pencils, paper, punch cards, and human minds pushed to their limits. The crypt analysts understood that every hour was critical, that the next message could contain intelligence capable of saving thousands of lives. The strategic impact extended far beyond Midway. Rashford's work demonstrated that signals intelligence could confer a decisive advantage in modern warfare. It showed that investing in code breaking, even when tasks seemed insurmountable, could yield results that altered history. It taught military leaders that trusting intelligence analysts and acting on their assessments, even when they contradicted conventional wisdom, could produce victories otherwise impossible. The transformation of the Pacific War beginning at Midway had ripple effects that shaped the world for decades. Japan's defeat led to American occupation and the emergence of Japan as a democratic ally. Pacific Islands became key positions in the Cold War. Carrier aviation tactics developed during the Pacific War dominated naval strategy for generations. The cryptanalysis techniques pioneered at Station Hypo evolved into the expansive signals intelligence apparatus of the National Security Agency. Lessons learned from breaking JN-25 influenced American intelligence practices throughout the Cold War and beyond. The integration of code analysis, traffic evaluation, and operational intelligence became standard practice. The use of IBM machines and later computers revolutionized the field. The recognition that signals intelligence required not only technical proficiency but also cultural awareness and operational understanding reshaped how intelligence agencies recruited and trained personnel. In 1985, a reunion brought together surviving members of Station Hypo and other Pacific Warcode analysts. Men in their 60s and 70s gathered to recall their younger selves working grueling hours in that basement dungeon, racing against time to provide their forces with any possible advantage. They recounted the dive bomber attack that destroyed 3 carriers in minutes, the discovery that AF meant Midway, the extended shifts fueled by coffee and stimulants, and Rashford working in his bathrobe because of the oppressive heat. Some wept remembering comrades who had not survived. Others marveled at what they had accomplished with primitive tools. All understood that they had participated in something remarkable, their work shaping history. The reunion offered many the first chance to speak openly about wartime experiences, sharing stories long classified. Edwin Layton, then in his 80s, recalled Rashford's certainty when presenting intelligence to Nimitz on May 27, 1942, the moral courage to insist on an answer despite Washington's disagreement. He remembered the moment Rashford revealed the exact location and timing of the Japanese strike. The precision of that intelligence was stunning. American carriers were positioned perfectly, and the Japanese sailed into a meticulously prepared ambush. None of it would have occurred without men like Rashford, who refused to believe the problem was unsolvable, who persevered when others would have quit, who trusted that intelligence and analysis could alter history. The reunion concluded with a statement encapsulating Station Hypo's achievement. One analyst declared what many were thinking: "We entered this war as mathematicians, linguists, and engineers solving puzzles. We left as people who changed history not through violence, but through understanding. Not through force, but through intelligence. We read the enemy's mind, saved thousands of lives, and shortened a terrible war." Joseph Rashford dedicated his career to doing what was right rather than politically safe. Thomas Deere labored through exhausting shifts fueled by stimulants. Every man and woman in that basement gave everything, knowing failure meant catastrophe. They proved that knowledge is power, that understanding an enemy can defeat him as surely as superior weapons, and that a small, dedicated team with the right skills and determination can achieve the seemingly impossible. The Japanese codes appeared unbreakable, roughly 30,000 to 33,000 code groups, super-enciphered, constantly changing. Yet they were broken, not by luck, but by intelligence, perseverance, and refusal to surrender, because they understood that success was imperative. Midway was won by pilots facing overwhelming anti-aircraft fire, by mechanics readying aircraft under impossible conditions, by commanders making bold decisions, and by sailors performing damage control on sinking ships, but it was made possible by intelligence, by codebreakers providing Nimitz certainty on May 27, 1942. To the memory of Joseph Rashford, born May 12, 1900, and passed before receiving his recognition on May 30, 1986, to Thomas Deere and every code analyst who sacrificed sleep, health, and sometimes sanity during those grueling shifts, to the linguists, traffic analysts, and radio intercept operators, your work changed history. The coders who cracked Japanese messages proved that intelligence, in both information and wisdom, is the most powerful weapon in war. The story of JN-25 demonstrates that wars are won not only by force, but by mind, that mathematical formulas, linguistic expertise, and relentless effort can triumph over entire armies. June 4, 1942 changed the Pacific War, but the real transformation began earlier, in the patient work of cryptanalysts who refused to accept Japanese codes as unbreakable, who labored under impossible conditions, and who proved that understanding the enemy is the first step to defeating him. They were mathematicians, linguists, sailors, marines, and officers, the code breakers who gave America the intelligence that won the Pacific War.